Maple Grove High School stood tall amidst the small town of Millbrook. Its red brick exterior bathed in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by lush green lawns. For most students, it was a beacon of education, a place of learning and growth. Yet for 15-year-old Ava Parker, it had become a daily battleground. Ava, a bright and ambitious sophomore, dreamed of becoming a civil rights attorney. Her dark skin glowed with vitality, and her tightly coiled hair was adorned with colorful beads that clicked softly as she walked through the halls. Despite her friendly demeanor and quick wit, Ava found herself increasingly isolated in her AP history class, taught by the formidable Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore was a fixture at Maple Grove, having taught there for over 3 decades. Her steel gray hair was always pulled back in a severe bun, and her thin lips seemed permanently set in a disapproving frown. Known for her strict teaching style and traditional values, she took immense pride in maintaining what she called academic rigor in her classroom. But what many didn't know was that beneath the veneer of professionalism, Mrs. Whitmore harbored deep-seated prejudices, shaped by her upbringing in a time and place where segregation was the norm. Ava, on the other hand, was the daughter of Dr. Marcus Parker, a renowned educator who had recently been appointed as the new principal of Maple Grove High. Dr. Parker and his wife had kept his new role a secret initially, wanting Ava to settle into the school on her own merits before his appointment became widely known. As one of the few black students in a predominantly white school, Ava was accustomed to standing out. However, in Mrs. Whitmore's class, she felt more than just different. She felt targeted. The teacher's subtle jabs, dismissive attitudes, and consistently lower grades despite Ava's hard work began to take their toll. Ava didn't confide in her parents. She was determined to handle the situation herself, proving to everyone, especially herself, that she could overcome any obstacle. But as the days passed, and Mrs. Whitmore's behavior worsened, Ava struggled to maintain her usual optimism and confidence. One fateful Monday morning, neither Ava nor Mrs. Whitmore could have predicted the dramatic confrontation that was about to unfold. The tension in Mrs. Whitmore's AP history class was palpable as students filed in, their nervous energy filling the room. Ava made her way to her usual spot in the back corner, her shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing for impact. Today's lesson was focused on the civil rights movement, a topic Ava had been both anticipating and dreading. As Mrs. Whitmore began her lecture, her tone was clipped and dismissive, reducing the struggles and triumphs of an entire generation to dry facts and dates. The movement, Mrs. Whitmore stated, was disruptive, but it eventually led to necessary changes. We must also consider the negative impacts on law and order during this time. Ava's heart rate quickened. She had heard first-hand accounts from her grandparents about the courage and sacrifice it took to stand up against systemic oppression. Before she could stop herself, her hand was in the air. Mrs. Whitmore noticed immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, Miss Parker?" she said, her voice tinged with irritation. Ava stood firm, despite her nerves. "I think it's important to note that the disruption was necessary because peaceful protests were often met with violence," she said, her voice steady. The movement wasn't just about changes, it was about basic human rights. A hush fell over the classroom. Students glanced nervously between Ava and Mrs. Whitmore, sensing the rising tension. Mrs. Whitmore's lips thinned into a tight line. "While I appreciate your passion, Miss Parker," Mrs. Whitmore replied, "I think you'll find that a more objective view of history is necessary in academic discourse. Your personal feelings don't change the facts." Ava's anger flared, but she didn't back down. "These are facts, Mrs. Whitmore. There's documented evidence of the violence and oppression faced by civil rights activists. Ignoring that paints an incomplete picture of history." The subtle tension between the two escalated rapidly. Mrs. Whitmore's face hardened, her mask of professionalism slipping. "Perhaps if you spent more time studying and less time arguing," she said, "your grades in this class might improve." A few students gasped at the thinly veiled insult. Ava felt as though she had been slapped, but she stood her ground. "My grades reflect the quality of my work, Mrs. Whitmore. If they're lower than they should be, perhaps the bias isn't on my end." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes flashed with anger. "That's quite enough, Miss Parker. I will not tolerate this kind of disrespect in my classroom." Perhaps a visit to the principal's office will help you remember your place. The word place hung heavily in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. Ava stood slowly, gathering her books, her heart racing. As she made her way to the door, she could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some filled with sympathy, others with discomfort. Just as Ava reached for the doorknob, Mrs. Whitmore's voice rang out. "Miss Parker," she said, dripping with disdain, "do try to remember that you're here on scholarship. It would be a shame if your attitude jeopardized that opportunity." Ava froze, her hand on the door. The implication was clear. Mrs. Whitmore thought Ava didn't belong here, that her presence was merely tolerated, not welcomed. Fighting back tears of frustration and anger, Ava left the classroom, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway as she made her way to the principal's office. Ava had wanted to handle this on her own, but now she realized that staying silent was no longer an option. As she knocked on her father's office door, she steeled herself for the conversation to come. Little did she know, this moment would be the catalyst for a series of events that would not only challenge Mrs. Whitmore's bigotry but also force the entire Maple Grove community to confront its deep-seated issues of racism. "Come in," Dr. Marcus Parker's warm, deep voice called from inside. Ava entered, closing the door softly behind her. Dr. Parker looked up, his professional neutrality shifting to concern as he recognized his daughter. "Ava, what's wrong, sweetheart?" The weight of the past few weeks pressed down on Ava as she began to speak. She told her father everything. Mrs. Whitmore's subtle jabs, the unfair grading, the dismissive attitudes, and the confrontation that had just occurred in class. As she spoke, Dr. Parker's face darkened, a mix of anger and dismay overtaking him. When she finished, tears streaming down her face, he rose from his desk and enveloped her in a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, Ava," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea this was happening. Why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I didn't want special treatment because you're the principal," Ava replied, wiping her eyes. "I thought I could change her mind if I just worked hard enough." Dr. Parker sighed deeply, his expression pained. "Ava, your mother and I are so proud of your strength and determination. But this isn't something you should have to face alone. Racism has no place in this school or anywhere else for that matter." Dr. Parker's face remained grim as he looked at Mrs. Whitmore, who had just entered the office to discuss the disciplinary issue involving Ava. When she saw Ava sitting with her father, her face drained of color. "Your daughter, Dr. Parker," Mrs. Whitmore began, her voice faltering, "has been causing trouble in my class." Dr. Parker interrupted her sharply. "I think we have more pressing matters to discuss." Mrs. Whitmore, his voice was firm, and the implication was clear. This was no longer about a simple classroom dispute. "I've just been informed that you have been discriminating against my daughter." Dr. Parker continued, "I'm deeply disappointed by your behavior. Your treatment of her is unacceptable." Rather than simply reprimanding Mrs. Whitmore, Ava suggested a more constructive approach. "We need to address this issue head-on. Not just for me, but for the entire school," Ava said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We need to create a dialogue. A space where we can all learn and grow together." Dr. Parker considered Ava's words, his expression softening as he realized the importance of her idea. "What do you propose?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. "I think we should form a committee, a group of students and teachers working together to create an anti-racism curriculum for the school," Ava said. "We need to bring these issues into the light and start educating ourselves about the history of racism in education." The decision to form the committee set off a ripple of change across the school. Ava, Mrs. Whitmore, and other teachers came together, leading discussions about how best to address the subtle racism that had pervaded the school for years. The first challenge was to create a curriculum that wasn't just about teaching facts, but about confronting the uncomfortable truths of history. Over the next few months, town hall meetings, workshops, and discussions became regular occurrences at Maple Grove. The community began to grapple with difficult questions, and though there were many who resisted the changes, Ava's vision and commitment kept the momentum going. The relationship between Ava and Mrs. Whitmore transformed, too, as Mrs. Whitmore engaged in self-reflection and began learning from the students. She started to understand the subtle biases she had carried with her for years. The once dismissive teacher began to see Ava as an ally, Rather than an adversary, the school's annual spring festival was reimagined as a cultural unity fair. Showcasing the efforts of the new curriculum, Ava and Mrs. Whitmore stood side by side at the event, leading conversations and workshops. The event marked a key turning point. The school's community was beginning to embrace change. However, the success of the fair drew protests from certain members of the community, who felt that the school was focusing too much on race. Mr. Thompson, one of the leading critics, tried to disrupt the event, but Ava took control. She delivered a powerful speech, inviting everyone to join the conversation and look at the bigger picture. Mrs. Whitmore stood by her, offering a symbol of unity. The protesters, caught off guard by Ava's eloquence and the united front of the student, teacher, and principal, began to deflate. Ava's words, backed by Mrs. Whitmore's support, transformed the protest into an opportunity for understanding. A few weeks later, the school held a town hall to address concerns and feedback about the changes that had taken place. Ava spoke with poise, addressing the criticisms with wisdom beyond her years. Mrs. Whitmore, for the first time in decades, publicly admitted that she had not been as neutral as she thought. She had been perpetuating biases under the guise of impartiality. By the end of the evening, the tension had shifted. Ava and Mrs. Whitmore had bridged the gap, and the community, though divided at times, was now united by their shared commitment to a more inclusive future. The final assembly of the school year marked the culmination of Ava's journey. Dr. Parker spoke of the changes the school had undergone, praising the courage of students and teachers who had stood up for what was right. As Ava and Mrs. Whitmore stood together on stage, it was clear that the journey had just begun. The transformation at Maple Grove High was a symbol of hope and a reminder that even in the face of deeply rooted prejudice, change was possible. Ava knew that her work was far from over. But as she stood beside Mrs. Whitmore, watching her school community celebrate their progress, she was filled with hope for herself, her school, and the future she was determined to shape.